All right. So I have, as I was saying, I have so much information, and some of it is going to be no doubt something that you've never heard before. Okay, so I hope you're excited about that. But let's just begin with prayer and ask the Lord to help us. Father, I thank you for your love and your goodness. I thank you for the privilege to share your word with my brothers and sisters and for us to learn together, Lord, to be changed and draw closer to you. And I just ask, Lord, that you would open up our spiritual eyes and ears and hearts, that we would receive something from you, something maybe that we've not seen before in your word. And I ask, God, that you would give me the ability to speak coherently and with much clarity, and that I can effectively communicate what I've studied, what I've learned, and what I really desire to share with my brothers and sisters tonight. And I thank you for it in Jesus' name, amen. So we're on lesson 7. If you have the handout that came, what I do is each week I give you a handout, but that handout is for the next week because it's a study thing that you can do during the week and you can study yourself. So tonight we're going to be looking at Joshua 9, 10, 11, and 12. And Joshua's, let's just call it the wars, the Joshua wars or the conquest wars. The first campaign battles that they encountered were really strategic for what they were going to be doing. There's the central campaign, the southern campaign, and the northern campaign. Now, the central campaign involved Jericho and Ai, and we've covered those two and what happened there. They were tests for Israel that demonstrated to them that where their strength lied for future battles was in the Lord. They were going to have to depend on the Lord for these battles. But they were also signs to the Canaanites that confirmed that God favored Israel and that God had a plan for them. So I'm going to rehash some of the story leading up to this when we get into chapter 10 and 11. But let's look first at Joshua chapter 9, verses 1 through 27. And this is Israel coming into the promised land, Canaan. And they've defeated Jericho, they defeated Ai, and now they're coming into some other parts of the campaign here. Let me see, oh, here it is, my maps. So, verse 1 of chapter 9, Joshua 9 says, and I'm reading from the NASB, now it came about when all the kings who were beyond the Jordan, so they were on the east side of the Jordan. It was called the Transjordan. They crossed the Jordan River. They defeated Jericho and Ai, and now they're encountering other kings of other cities. So now all the kings who were beyond the Jordan, in the hill country and in the lowland and on the coast of the Great Sea toward Lebanon, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusites, heard of it. What did they hear of? They heard of the defeat of Ai. That they gathered themselves together with one accord to fight with Joshua and with Israel. Now the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai. They also acted craftily and set out as envoys and took worn-out sacks on their donkeys and wineskins worn out and torn and mended, and worn out and patched sandals on their feet, and worn out clothes on themselves, and all the bread of their provision was dry and had become crumbled. Let me see if I can, okay, so if you'll turn on the second page of the maps, that's actually two maps. I should have delineated it, the two maps with a line right about here. But in the bottom part, you can see where Joshua and his people are in Gilgal, and their Gibeon is really a fairly close town. Okay? But yet the Gibeonites sent an envoy with worn out sacks, worn out clothes, worn out wineskins, crumbled up old dry bread to talk to Joshua. They went to Joshua at the camp at Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, "We have come from a far country. Now therefore make a covenant with us." Well, they hadn't come from a far country. They're just right around the road there. The men of Israel said to the Hivites, "Perhaps you are living within our land. How then shall we make a covenant with you?" But they said to Joshua, "We are your servants." Then Joshua said to them, "Who are you and where do you come from?" They said to him, "Your servants have come from a very far country. Because of the fame of the Lord of your God, we have heard the report of him and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon, king of Heshbon, and to Og, king of Bashan, who was at Ashtaroth." So if you look at that first map, you'll see that Bashan is up in the upper section. Ashtaroth is there. And so he said, when you were on this side of Jordan, on the east, the Transjordan, the east side of Jordan, we heard about what you did to these kings over there. Kings, specifically King Sihon and King Og. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spoke to us, saying, "Take provisions in your hand for the journey and go to meet them and say to them, 'We are your servants. Now then make a covenant with us.' This our bread was warm when we took it for our provisions out of our houses on the day we left to come to you. But now, behold, it is dry and has become crumbled." So they're really putting on a ruse here. None of this is true, what they're saying, other than we heard about what you did to Sihon and King Og. These wineskins which we filled were new. And behold, now they're torn. And these our clothes and our sandals are worn out because of a very long journey. We've traveled a long ways to come to you, to make a covenant with you. So the men of Israel took some of their provisions and did not ask for the counsel of the Lord. Very important. Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them and let them live. And the leaders of the congregation swore an oath to them. It came about at the end of 3 days after they had made a covenant with them that they heard that they were neighbors and that they were living within their land. Then the sons of Israel set out and came to their cities on the 3rd day. Now their cities were Gibeon, Chephariah, and Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. You guys got those names? Okay. I just say them like I know what I'm saying. I don't know. That may be how they're pronounced, or I don't know. The sons of Israel did not strike them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and the whole congregation grumbled against the leaders. So they made a pact. They said, we won't harm you. And we're going to get to why that pact was important here in a minute. But when they found out that, they didn't really come from a long ways off, they're just right here in the land where we live, we were supposed to treat them differently according to what the Lord had given them instruction for. But all the leaders said to the whole congregation, "We have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we cannot touch them. This we will do to them, even let them live, so that wrath will not be upon us for the oath which we swore to them." The leaders said to them, "Let them live." So they became hewers of wood and drawers of water for the whole congregation, just as the leaders had spoken to them. So in other words, we're not going to kill you, but you're going to be our slaves for the rest of your generations. Then Joshua called for them and spoke to them, saying, "Why have you deceived us, saying, 'We are very far from you,' when you are living within our land? Now therefore you are cursed, and you shall never cease being slaves, both hewers of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God? So they answered Joshua and said, Because it was certainly told your servants that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land, and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land before you. Therefore we feared greatly for our lives because of you. You have done this and have done this thing. Now behold, we are in your hands. Do as it seems good and right in your sight to do to us. Thus he did to them, and delivered them from the hands of the sons of Israel, and did not kill them. But Joshua made them that day hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to this day, in the place which he would choose. So I'm going to stop there. And I really doubt that we'll get through everything tonight, but we'll just pick up next week where we left off. So Israel is now entering the southern part of their campaign, and this covers Joshua 9:1 really through 10:28. So we'll read 10 in just a minute. So when you read through the chapter carefully, I wrote down, record your observations. Let the following questions suggest some studies. Why did the kings of 9:1 decide to fight against Israel? What military advantage did they count on? Well, they probably felt they had no choice. They knew that Israel had already defeated Jericho and Ai. They knew that Israel had already defeated King Sihon and King Og on the east side of Jordan. And now they felt that they had to defend themselves. So they probably thought their military campaign advantage came from their alliance with one another. And that surely they're thinking 5 armies can defeat Israel. Turn my phone off. Sorry. 5 armies would be enough to defeat Israel. So, but then we have to ask ourselves, why did the Gibeonites, who are identified as Hivites, want to get under the protecting cover of Israel? Well, very simple. They didn't want to be destroyed. They didn't want to be destroyed. They feared for their lives and did whatever they could to preserve their families. Now, there's some context to this deception, and the reason that Israel and Joshua decided to allow them to make a covenant. It goes back to Deuteronomy chapter 20. So look back at Deuteronomy chapter 20. And this is some of the instruction that the Lord gave to Moses when they were wandering in the wilderness and getting ready to begin the campaign after the generation had died that weren't allowed to go into the promised land because they grumbled and complained against the Lord. And so the Lord gave them some laws of warfare. He said, this is how you are to handle it. So look back, chapter 20, verse 10. When you approach a city to fight against it, you shall offer it terms of peace. If it agrees to make peace with you and opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall become your forced labor and shall serve you. However, if it does not make peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. When the Lord your God gives it into your hand, you shall strike all the men in it with the edge of the sword. Verse 14, only the women and children and the animals and all that is in the city, all its spoil, you shall take as booty for yourself. And you shall use the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord God, your God, has given you. Verse 15, this is a key verse. Thus you shall do to all the cities that are very far from you, which are not of the cities of these nations nearby. So if it's far away, that's treated. Verse 16 through 19. Let's continue reading. Only in the cities of these people that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you shall not leave alive anything that breathes. That's it, those that are near you. But you shall utterly destroy. Now, that word utterly destroy, we're going to read it over and over again when we get into Joshua chapter 10. It means devoted to destruction. If you have an ESV, English Standard Version Bible, it will read devoted to destruction rather than utterly destroy them. But you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, and the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite, as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that they may not teach you to do according to their detestable things which they have done for their gods, so that you would sin against the Lord your God. When you besiege a city a long time to make war against it in order to capture it, you shall not destroy its trees by swinging an axe against them, for you may eat from them, and you shall not cut them down. For is the tree of the field a man, that he should be besieged by you? So just kind of some rules of war that God set out for Israel. It's important to understand. So the Gibeonites presented themselves as someone who is far away. So they said, well, they're no threat. They're not in our land. So we'll make a covenant with them. They want to make a peaceful covenant, but they're going to be our slaves. What big mistake do you think Joshua and the men of Israel make that kept them from recognizing this deceitful act on the part of the Gibeonites? Okay, verse 14, very good. Verse 14 said, so the men of Israel took some of the provisions and did not ask for the counsel of the Lord. Too often we move without asking God, is this the right thing to do? I will raise my hand many, many times that I have done that. I just go on about my business thinking I know what's best, and I don't even inquire of the Lord. And it may be something simple, and it's not maybe not something serious, but yet we should inquire of the Lord on decisions that we're making. The fifth question I have there is, why did the princes of Israel insist on keeping the pact that they had made with the Gibeonites? Well, because Joshua and the leaders of Israel had given their word that they would let them live, and they ratified that by an oath. Know this, the Lord takes your oath very seriously. You think that the court system takes your oath seriously? Huh? Well, I mean, if you get up there and you commit perjury, that's a pretty serious offense. Yeah. You get up there and lie to the judge, you might find yourself in jail for a few days. Yeah. But the judge will take a perjury, or not being truthful and keeping your oath, if you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. And God does too. God even much more so. One of the main reasons for God's judgment and death upon the Canaanites was to protect Israel from the idolatrous practices and the idolatrous influences of those nations. So what then was the problem that's with sparing the Gibeonites? What was the problem there? How was this at least partially solved in Joshua's curse on them? Well, there was the potential for the idolatrous practices of the Gibeonites to influence Israel. The Gibeonites would have to serve as woodcutters and water carriers for the house of God and for the people of Israel. So that was why that was done. In later years, blessings came to the Gibeonites. For example, in their privilege to help Israel rebuild the walls of Jerusalem in Nehemiah 7:25. But there's also references to the exaltation of the place Gibeon. We'll see that in Joshua 10 and in 1 Kings and in the Chronicles. But how do you explain the blessing in view of the curse decreed by Joshua? Well, my answer was it could be that over the years Gibeon became influenced by the Israelites rather than the other way around. Gibeon was influenced by the Israelites and their God, and so they felt like they were now a part of the community of Israel. All right, chapter 10. This is where it starts getting interesting. Now it came about when Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had captured Ai and had utterly destroyed or devoted it to destruction, just as he had done to Jericho and its king, so he had done to Ai and its king, and that the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were within their land. So these other kings find this out. And he feared greatly because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were mighty. Therefore Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, sent word to Hoham, king of Hebron, and to Piram, king of Jarmuth, and to Japhia, king of Lachish, and to Debir, king of Eglon, saying, "Come up with me, help me, and let us attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the sons of Israel." So the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon, gathered together and went up, they with all their armies, and camped by Gibeon and fought against them. Then the men of Gibeon sent word to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal, saying, "Do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites that live in the hill country have assembled against us." So he said, "We're your servants. We've got a pact. We've got a covenant. All these kings are coming against us. You got to come help us. We can't defeat these kings." So Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the valiant warriors. The Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear them, for I have given them into your hand. Not one of them shall stand before you." So Joshua came upon them suddenly by marching all night from Gilgal. And the Lord confounded them before Israel, and he slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and pursued them by the way of the ascent of Beth Horon, and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. As they fled from before Israel, while they were at the descent of Beth Horon, the Lord threw large stones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died from the hailstones than those whom the sons of Israel killed with the sword. Then Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day, when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the sons of Israel, and he said in the sight of Israel, "O sun, stand still at Gibeon, and O moon, in the valley of Ajalon." So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. It is not written in the book, he asks the question, is it not written in the book of Jashar? Now I'm going to stop there for just a second. We don't have a book of Jashar in the Bible. But understand that a lot of what's written in the Bible is also written in other books, other ancient books. So oftentimes, if you're a scholar of the Old Testament especially, you will go to some of these other ancient books and read what they say and collaborate it with the story of the Bible. Doesn't mean you're doubting the Bible. It's just you're looking at getting the big picture. You can get a fuller picture of what's going on. So he says this is even written in this book called Jashar. I don't have that book. I don't know where it is. But he said it was written in this book of Jashar. And the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. There was no day like that before it or after it, when the Lord listened to the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Then Joshua and all Israel with him returned to the camp at Gilgal. Now these 5 kings had fled and hidden themselves in the caves at Makkedah. It was told Joshua, saying, "The 5 kings have been found hidden in the cave at Makkedah." Joshua said, "Roll large stones against the mouth of the cave and assign men by it to guard them. But do not stay there yourselves. Pursue your enemies and attack them in the rear. Do not allow them to enter their cities, for the Lord your God has delivered them into your hand." It came about when Joshua and the sons of Israel had finished slaying them with a very great slaughter until they were destroyed, and the survivors who remained of them had entered the fortified cities, that all the people returned to the camp to Joshua at Makkedah in peace. No one uttered a word against any of the sons of Israel. Then Joshua said, "Open the mouth of the cave, and bring these 5 kings out to me from the cave." So they did so, and brought these 5 kings out to him from the cave: the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. When they brought these kings out to Joshua, Joshua called for all the men of Israel and said to the chiefs of the men of war who had gone with him, "Come near, put your feet on the necks of these kings." So they came near and put their feet on their necks. Joshua said to them, "Do not fear or be dismayed. Be strong and courageous, for thus the Lord will do to all your enemies with whom you fight." So afterward Joshua struck them and put them to death, and he hanged them on 5 trees, and they hung on the trees until evening. It came about at sunset that Joshua gave a command, and they took them down from the trees and threw them into the cave where they had hidden themselves, and put large stones over the mouth of the cave to this very day. Now Joshua captured Makkedah on that day, and struck it and its kings with the edge of the sword. He utterly destroyed, or devoted it to destruction, and every person who was in it. He left no survivor. Thus he did to the king of Makkedah, just as he had done to the king of Jericho. Then Joshua and all Israel with him passed on from Makkedah to Libnah, and fought against Libnah. And the Lord gave it also with its king to the hands of Israel, and he struck it and every person who was in it with the edge of the sword. He left no survivor in it. Thus he did to its king, just as he had done to the king of Jericho. And Joshua and all Israel with him passed on from Libnah to Lachish, and they camped by it and fought against it. The Lord gave Lachish into the hands of Israel, and he captured it on the 2nd day, and struck it with every person who was in it with the edge of the sword, according to all that he had done to Libnah. Then Horam, the king of Gezer, came up to help Lachish, and Joshua defeated him and his people until he had left him no survivor. And Joshua and all Israel with him passed on from Lachish to Eglon, and they camped by it and fought against it. They captured it on that day and struck it with the sword, and he utterly destroyed, or devoted to destruction, that day every person who was in it, according to all that he had done to Lachish. Then Joshua and all Israel with him went up from Eglon to Hebron. They fought against it. They captured it and struck it and its king and all its cities and all the persons who were in it with the edge of the sword. He left no survivor, according to all that he had done to Eglon, and he utterly destroyed, or devoted it to destruction, and every person who was in it. Then Joshua and all Israel with him returned to Debir and fought against it. He captured it and its king and all its cities, and they struck them with the edge of the sword and utterly destroyed every person who was in it. He left no survivor, just as he had done to Hebron, so he did to Debir and its king, and as he had also done to Libnah and its king. Then Joshua struck all the land and the hill country and the Negev and the lowland and the slopes and all their kings. He left no survivor, but he utterly destroyed, or devoted to destruction, all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Joshua struck them from Kadesh Barnea, even as far as Gaza, and all the country of Goshen, even as far as Gibeon. Joshua captured all these kings and their lands at one time, because the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. So Joshua and all Israel with him returned to the camp at Gilgal. Okay, so that's a long reading, and it seems like on the surface when you read that, you think, wow, I mean, Joshua is just a war machine, just killing everybody. But there's a reason behind this that is not talked about much. It's a supernatural spiritual thing that's going on behind these wars. And it involves the clan of the giants. the Anakim, the Nephilim, the Rephaim. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that this evening or next week. Why did the kings want to battle Gibeon? Well, because they had made a pact with Israel, and they probably felt like they could defeat Israel, but they couldn't defeat Israel, but they could defeat Gibeon. And this was probably the first time that Joshua faced a coalition of armies. I'm sure he had greater concern about defeating 5 armies, but God's assurance was similar to other times to Joshua. He told Joshua, he said, don't be afraid of them. He said, I've given them into your hand. Not one of them will be able to withstand you. Now, there's 2 miracles that are recorded in this battle war campaign that Joshua's going through here with all these 5 kings. The hailstones and the sun and moon standing still. The question is asked, how does this last phrase of verse 13 indicate that Joshua's prayer concerning the sun and moon was for military advantage? So you look at 10:13, it says, until the nations avenge themselves of their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jeshar, and the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day? It seems as if Joshua needed the extra time of daylight in order to finish the battle. That's all I can say about that. Because there's different possible readings of verses 12 and 13, people who are expert Old Testament scholars differ over their interpretations. I don't ever want to come to you and say, listen, this is how it is. I read and I study, and so many different people have so many different logical explanations, and I try to share those with you and pray that you are able to discern for yourself what you feel like you're comfortable with. But there's many interpretations as to what was the nature of Joshua's request. Here's 3 possibilities that I have. One is, when the battle was proceeding during the early hours of dawn, Joshua prayed for an extension of semi-darkness, which God sent by the way of a storm of hailstones that lasted throughout the day. So that's one explanation. Another reading is that Joshua needed an extension of daylight to complete the battle, so he asked for a prolonged day. This God gave by slowing down the earth's rotation, making one full rotation to last 48 hours. Possible. I don't know. The third is Joshua's exhausted army needed relief from the heat of the sun. So Joshua prayed that the sun would, quote, leave off or become impotent in its beating down upon the troops. And so God did this by the hailstorm. Now, someone asked me before we got started, have I ever seen some of the miracles that are mentioned, like the Jordan Sea waters backing up and walking across? And my answer was no. And they followed up by, well, why do we not see stuff like that today? And I said, well, it was needed for that day. I don't know that it's needed for today, but it was needed for this time, this point in history, this point in Israel's expansion and moving to the west. So I don't know how it does. I can't explain it to you. I can't explain it to you. I just know that somehow Joshua won the battle through this moon and sun standing still, or whatever it was, however it was accomplished. And there are people that might make the objection and say, well, why even pray about things when the Lord will accomplish his will anyways? Well, it does matter that we pray. Even though God is sovereign and all-knowing, we use the word omniscient to to identify or to describe God, that he knows everything, he still asks us to pray. There's a passage of scripture in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 8. It says, for do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. So God knows what we need before we ask him, but he still says, ask. Notice the last phrase of Joshua 10:14. There was no day like that before it or after it, when the Lord listened to the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. How is this an all-inclusive commentary on Israel's battles against the Canaanites? Well, although the Lord helped Israel win the different battles they were in, the stopping of the earth's rotation was on a completely different level. Okay, I mean, it's completely different. They could have thought, yes, God would help us win the battle, but in the back of their minds, it could be that there was confidence in themselves, that it was possible they won because of their own strength and ability. Yet this stopping of the sun and the moon, they knew God had to be the one to help them. Make sure I got my pages straight here. I usually don't print. Okay. Right. They didn't know this. They thought the sun moved. They thought the earth was the center of the universe. They thought the sun moved around. Yeah. I agree. Yeah. So there's this often repeated words here on all these cities. If you look at let's see, the bottom of on the second page, the bottom map, you see Eglon, you see Debur, you see Hebron, Makkedah, Libnah, Lachish, and all those cities. Those were all the cities. Many of those were the ones that came against Gibeon. Well, they all ended up being destroyed. Then he moves to chapter 11, and this is where I think we're going to find some fascinating text. So chapter 11, verses 1 through 24. Then it came about when Jabin, king of Hazor, heard of it, that he sent to Jobab, king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and the king of Axapha, and to the kings who are of the north in the hill country, and in the Arabah, south of Shinneroth, and in the lowland, and on the heights of Dor on the west, to the Canaanites on the east, and on the west, and the Amorites, and the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Jebusites in the hill country, and the Hivites at the foot of Hermon, Mount Hermon, in the land of Mizpah. They came out, they and all their armies with them, as many people as the sand is on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. Okay, let me stop there for just a second. How many know what hyperbole is? You know, we often say, well, you have to take the Bible literally. Okay, so do we literally believe that they had as many people as there is sand on the seashore? Is that even possible? Yeah, it's hyperbole. What it means is there is a great number of people. A great number of people. And we'll look at some other texts that talk about that too. So there's a great number of people and many horses. Verse 5, so all these kings, having agreed to meet, came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid because of them, for tomorrow at this time I will deliver all of them slain before Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire." So Joshua and all the people of war with him came up and set on them suddenly by the waters of Merom and attacked them. The Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel, so that they defeated them and pursued them as far as the great Sidon and Mizrapothmaim of the valley of Mizpah to the east, and they struck them until no survivor was left to them. Joshua did to them as the Lord had told him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. Then Joshua turned back at that time and captured Hazor, struck its king with the sword. For Hazor formerly was the head of all these kingdoms. They struck every person who was in it with the edge of the sword, and utterly destroyed them, devoted them to destruction. There was no one left who breathed, and burned Hazor with fire. Joshua captured all the cities of these kings and all their kings, and he struck them with the edge of the sword and utterly destroyed them, or devoted them to destruction, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. However, Israel did not burn any cities that stood on their mounds, except Hazor alone, which Joshua burned. All the spoil of these cities and the cattle the sons of Israel took as their plunder, and they struck every man with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them. They left no one who breathed. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. Now you remember, Moses is dead at this time. But God had told Moses what to do. Moses told Joshua what to do. And he left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. Thus Joshua took all the land, the hill country, and all the Negev, all that land from Goshen, the lowland, the Arabah, the hill country of Israel and its lowland, from Mount Halak that rises towards Sur, even as far as Baal-gad in the valley of Lebanon at the foot of Mount Hermon. And he captured all their kings, and he struck them down and put them to death. Joshua waged war a long time with all these kings. There was not a city which made peace with the sons of Israel, except the Hivites living in Gibeon. They took them all in battle. For it was the Lord to harden their hearts to meet Israel in battle, in order that he might utterly destroy them, that they might have no mercy, that he might destroy them, just as the Lord commanded Moses. Now pay attention, verse 21 and 22. Then Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim. Who knows what the Anakim is? But it's odd that this is in there. It cut, the giants. The Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. There were no Anakim, also Rephaim, Nephilim, giants. We'll talk about that in a minute. There were no Anakim left in the land of the sons of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. Okay? Well, that's the area of the Philistines, who later on does Israel encounter of the Philistines? Goliath. So there were still some around. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes. Thus the land had rest from war. So there's not a lot of verses devoted to this important campaign, but the questions ask, what was the military strength of the kings of the Northern Alliance, and had Joshua met such strength before? It seems their strength seemed to be great. They're described as numerous as the sand on the seashore, which is hyperbole, or just saying there's a lot of people, a lot. And it was probably the biggest army that Joshua and Israel had faced, is the way I look at it. I want to talk a little bit, because I don't have much time, as I want to finish, about these giants, because there's more to this than just Joshua going in and taking these cities. There were remnants of the Anakim. Who are the Anakim of Joshua 11, 21, 22? They were the giants. Follow me carefully here. They were the giants that were the human spawn, human offspring that resulted when the sons of God came down in Genesis 6 and had sexual relations with the daughters of men. Okay? Turn with me, if you will. We're going to go back in time to Genesis 6. I know some of you are thinking, this is crazy, Keith. What are you talking about? Genesis 6, 1 through 4. This is after the fall in Eden. This is really the next step, the next great fall or great chaos that comes about. In chapter 6 of Genesis, verse 1. Now it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them. So the men multiplying on the land, daughters are being born, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. The Nephilim are the giants, the clans of the giant people. And also afterward. They were on the earth in those days and also afterward. Because the flood happens later and it supposedly destroys everything. But we know, according to the spies' testimony in Numbers chapter 13, that they saw, when they entered into Canaan to spy out the land to see what they needed to do, they saw the descendants of Anak, or the Anakim, giants. It said, and we looked like grasshoppers in their sight. So we know that those, however they lived, and I have my own thoughts on that, and I'll share with you, but the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. When the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. So the sons of God were divine beings. When God created, He created not just the physical world that we see. He created the supernatural, spiritual world also. Whatever that entails. I don't know what it all entails. The Bible gives us some indication. These sons of God were divine beings whom Yahweh created. In Genesis 6, 1 through 4, it explicitly describes the sin that they committed by violating the domain boundary that existed between heaven and earth, between the spiritual and the physical, if you will. They crossed the boundary from the spiritual to the physical, from heaven to the earth. They violated the boundary that God had established. They somehow assumed a human form and as a result had sexual relations with the earthly women, and as a result the race of giants called Nephilim came about. When Israel left Egypt, they came to Canaan, and Moses sent spies out into the land, and the spies reported back to Moses in Numbers chapter 13. Oh, back this way. Numbers 13. Let's just read it. Verses 32 through 33. They report back this. So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone in spying it out is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people whom we saw in it were men of great size. There also we saw the Nephilim. The sons of Anak are part of the Nephilim. And we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. So they report that there were men of great size. They were the descendants of the Nephilim, which Scripture tells us were the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of man when they had relations. The Nephilim were their offspring. They were giants. Israel refused to believe that Yahweh would help them defeat the sons of Anak. They're in Numbers chapter 13. When you get into Numbers chapter 14, they grumbled and complained and said, let's go back to Egypt. We don't need this. And because they rebelled and wandered, they ended up wandering for 40 years in the wilderness until that generation died. If you want to read a fascinating account, a very detailed theological study of the unseen realm, the supernatural world, I highly recommend this book by Dr. Michael Heiser called The Unseen Realm. Dr. Heiser believes that to understand these Anakim, or these Nephilim, or Rephaim as they're called in some places, you have to understand the original ancient context of the biblical writers who put the Old Testament account of Israel's history into its final form. I'm going to read just a portion of some of the things that I've highlighted that in this book that I want to bring to your attention. I won't get through all of it tonight because I don't have time, but Dr. Heiser writes in this book, it's on page 192 of The Unseen Realm. He says, it is no accident that by all accounts this work, or the writing of Numbers, was finished while Israel was in exile in Babylon. The biblical writers deliberately connect the giant clan enemies Israel would face in the conquest back to the ancient apostasies that had Babylon at their root. The sons of God and the Nephilim and the disinheritance of the nations at the Tower of Babel. If you read Genesis, you have the fall in Eden, Adam and Eve. You have this terrible debacle of the sons of God having relations with women, of men, and creating this race of Nephilim. That's the second one. That brought about the flood. And then then you've got the Tower of Babel. After the flood, you've got the Tower of Babel, where that's the next fall. So these incidents inform the Israelites' supernatural spiritual worldview. They are at the heart of what's at stake in the war of the Promised Land. Israel will encounter and this is what's important, Israel is going to encounter two deadly forces when they go into Canaan. The descendants of the Nephilim, they were there, they saw them, and the people of the nations under the dominion of the hostile gods. The two are at times conflated in the narrative. Both must be defeated, but one in particular must be annihilated. Really, it was a matter of the people being in the wrong place at the wrong time, because the goal was to get rid of the Nephilim, who were at odds with God's plan for the world and for humanity. I told you that you might hear something different. I recommend this book. I mean, it is difficult to read. I read it over, and I've read it over and over and over, and I want to understand it better. But we know that near the end of the 40 years of wandering, God directed Moses to lead the new generation back toward Canaan. But instead of heading into Canaan from the south, as they did before, God brought them alongside Canaan. You can see on that first map, that was the route that they took. Okay, they went up first. They went north along Canaan. And you can read that whole narrative, and we're going to do that next week. That will be in Deuteronomy chapter 2. I would encourage you to read Deuteronomy chapter 2 and Deuteronomy chapter 3. That's the narrative of this. And you're going to encounter a king by the name of Og. Going to talk about his bed, how big it was, 9 cubits long by 4 cubits wide, huge. It had to be so big because he was just a big man. He was the king. And he was the king of Bashan. So I got a lot to share with you next week. I appreciate the attentiveness tonight. Mm-hmm. Right. 9 feet, yeah. So, and here's the thing. The average Israelite of that day was a fairly small person. 5 foot. I think I read somewhere 5'4", maybe something like that. And these giants weren't 20 feet tall or anything, but you put a 5'4" person or 5'2" person up against some modern day basketball players. There's a huge difference by feet, and they do look so much smaller. So it's kind of the comparison that we're looking at here. Anyways, so we'll pick up there next week. I appreciate so much the attentiveness, and I look forward to sharing more with you next week. God bless you. Thanks for watching online too.